Good evening. Hi. Um, Tonight on Instagram, I seem to be on fire. I'm doing a session on strikes in literature tonight, and I wonder if I can get that filter off now. I don't know if I can. That's gonna be tricky. How do I even do that? I think I'll have to stop and start again. Sorry, guys. Let's start again. Sorry about this. Here we go, being a bit technologically unintelligent here, but hopefully this is a moment when people will be joining. I am doing strikes in literature because today is Walkout Wednesday. So I thought it was a sensible moment to do strikes in literature. Uh, so we're going to start. This is going to be a short one tonight because I've actually just done another event with Jericho writers who were absolutely marvelous. And it was an event all about finding your comparative titles, which is a really good idea. Jericho writers are a really good group that you can join if you're an aspiring writer because they help you in very many brilliant ways like editing, finding your comparative titles, helping you write your blurb to agents, all those kinds of things. Any aspiring writers out there, check out Jericho Writers. They're pretty fantastic and they do all sorts of amazing events every week. So have a look at their website and it's quite a cheap subscription as well. So tonight, strikes in literature because it's Walkout Wednesday. I think at least 100,000 workers in the civil service have not been at work today. Teachers, railway strikers, um, many transport workers, some university college tutors as well have been all on strike. So I thought this is the moment to look at strikes in literature. And the one that's the most famous and which everyone seems to love the most and talk about the most is Emile Zola's Germinal, which was published in 1885. And it was the 13th novel in his great Rougon Macquart sequence, which I think was 20 novels in total. And they are all absolutely brilliant novels. Uh, Definitely highly recommended. 20 novels, though, it is a bit of an undertaking, but you don't have to read them all. I must admit, I haven't read all of them myself, but the ones I have read, I've loved. So this one is called Germinal, and it's about Etienne Lantier, an unemployed railway worker who's a clever but uneducated young man with a dangerous temper. He's forced to take a back-breaking job at Le Voreux mine when he can't get other work, and he discovers that his fellow miners are ill, hungry, in debt, and unable to feed and clothe their families. When conditions in the mining community deteriorate even further, Lantier finds himself leading a strike that could mean starvation or salvation for all. So that is the book that seems to come up as the most popular strike novel. Do tell me if you know of any yourselves, because I'd love to know. There don't seem to be that many out there. There's a few children's books about strikes, but none of them that I found seemed that good. Surely this is something that someone needs to write. Um, I was just going to give you a little bit more about Zola. Zola, he is such an amazing writer because he does have an incredible attention to detail. And I'm sorry I don't have the book to share with you, and I'm doing a short one tonight anyway. But he really does get the atmosphere of the time absolutely nailed. Another one that comes up when you start delving into literature about strikes is David Peace's GB84, which looks at the battle between Margaret Thatcher and the miners during the 1980s. And Peace writes brilliantly about the day to day life of the striking miners and the effect it has on their families. Lots of us are more familiar, perhaps, with those subjects through watching films such as, which is one with the amazing dancer? It's totally gone from my mind, if any of you can think of it. Anyway, there's a lot of amazing um, films about strikes, but not that many brilliant novels about it. So, David Peace, GB84, writing brilliantly about the day to day life. Full Monty, thank you. That is a good one. There's another one too with a boy who's a dancer. He's only like 14, and it all takes place during the time of the mining strikes. Billy, is he called Billy? It will come back to us. Someone will remember. It might be me. Um, so, another book which is particularly interesting in terms of representations of political struggle in literature, of which there are many, is Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow. Thank you. Billy Elliot. That's what I was trying to remember. Ah, now it's coming in thick and fast. You're all remembering Billy Elliot, which is a brilliant film. I'd actually love to watch that again. Highly topical, maybe right now, in some ways. So, in Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow, Emma Goldman appears as a character in the novel who attempts to fight for the rights of workers and ordinary people in New York City. And this is brilliantly depicted by Doctorow. Goldman was constantly harassed and arrested, and Doctorow reminds us that without the passion of such people, we'd probably all still be working at weekends. Paid holiday would not exist. Abortion would be illegal, and there'd be no benefits at all. Emma Goldman was completely concerned with the rights of women and did much to drive the issue of equal rights onto the agenda worldwide. Brassed off. Thanks for that one as well. That is another. There's quite a lot of those excellent films in that genre, aren't there? Why aren't there more novels? Or maybe there are, and I just haven't found them. Another novel that I would like to highly recommend, actually, it's not a novel, it's a memoir, is Damien Barr's Maggie and Me, which I know I've talked about on here before. Just trying to grab a copy to show you. I wasn't necessarily being completely well organised tonight due to having the previous event earlier. Uh, and actually, I haven't even found his memoir. Annoyingly, I found his novel instead. And by the way, brilliant novel. You'll Be Safe Here, set in South Africa. Not what I was going to talk about. I was going to talk about Maggie and Me. It's the 10th anniversary of Maggie and Me. It came out 10 years ago. And that is a book which is set in the time when Damien was growing up in Scotland under the eye, in a way, of Maggie Thatcher. And there were lots of terrible political events going on and strikes. And these all affected young Damien as he was growing up. And it's a really beautifully told memoir, which totally reads like a novel, utterly gripping. And he very neatly parallels the edicts that Maggie Thatcher is giving out with what's going on in his own life. He's only aged from about 8 up to 18 in that book, and it goes through all the various ways that Maggie Thatcher affected him and his father, who worked in a steelworks just outside Glasgow, and that steelworks gave um, Damien a second dawn every morning because it gave off so much light coming out from the factory. Lovely to see you here, Guy. I'm talking about strikes in literature this evening, and I was just talking about Damien Barr's fantastic memoir, Maggie and Me, which is full of the effects of Margaret Thatcher on the world around him as he was growing up. But I'm not really talking about memoir. I'm trying more to talk about novels this evening. But I am going to mention the fantastic sex strike in Lysistrata, which was by Aristophanes, written a couple of thousand years ago. It's an ancient Greek comedy, originally performed in classical Athens in 411 BC. And it's a comic account of a woman's extraordinary mission to end the Peloponnesian War. So, this woman in Lysistrata was actually trying to end a war by going on a sex strike, which is a brilliantly hilarious idea. It was a war between the Greek city states, and this woman led a sex strike with all her fellow women of the time and denied all the men of the land any sex. Pretty impressive that she managed to get that organised. And it was the only thing that they truly and deeply desired, apparently, according to Aristophanes. So Lysistrata persuaded the women of the warring cities to withhold sexual privileges from their husbands and lovers as a means of forcing the men to negotiate peace, which was a strategy that inflamed the battle between the sexes. So it didn't necessarily do what she wanted it to do. The play is notable for being an early expose of sexual relations in a male dominated society. And it is a play that is still hilarious. And there's been many excellent modern versions of it. So Lysistrata by Aristophanes is not to be forgotten as a rather excellent example of a strike, but of a different kind to the political strikes that we're mostly talking about this evening. So Steinbeck must also be mentioned as a brilliant novelist who wrote about workers being underprivileged, underpaid, and underrepresented generally in most fashions. And he wrote this book called In Dubious Battle, which is one of his novels which is probably not so much read today, but it's still an admirably observed novel of social unrest. And it is actually very fast paced, believe it or not. So it's set in the California apple country, where a strike by migrant workers against rapacious landowners spirals out of control. Caught in the upheaval is Jim Nolan, a once aimless man who finds himself in the absolute middle of the strike. So it deals very much with the fruit workers' strike in this California valley, which ought to be an idyllic spot. And it deals with the attempts of labour unions to organise, lead, and provide for the striking pickers. So it's all quite intense, quite a complicated plot at times. The course of the strike is recounted in some detail, but there are some very dramatic moments which make it into a really great read. And the dubious battle of the strikers continues. It is a really great novel, which is sadly slightly neglected these days. Another novel which people don't necessarily read very much nowadays is Sometimes a Great Notion by Ken Kesey, who is the writer of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So Ken Kesey or Casey, I think it's Kesey, but I might well be wrong. Um, he wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which achieved massive critical and popular success. And he then wrote this book, which is far lesser known, Sometimes a Great Notion, which tells the wild spirited tale of a bitter strike that rages through a small lumber town along the Oregon coast. Bucking that strike out of sheer cussedness are the Stampers. Out of the Stamper family's rivalries and betrayals, Ken Kesey has crafted a novel with the mythic impact of a Greek tragedy. So that is definitely one to have a look at as well. How Green Was My Valley is a book by Richard Llewellyn, um, which is a poignant coming of age novel set in a Welsh mining town, which is a paean to a more innocent age. and a book that is still very much beloved now, even though it was written a long time ago. It's about Morgan, who is grows up in a mining community in rural South Wales. He's taught many harsh lessons at the kitchen table, at the chapel, and around the pit head. He writes this novel, the character writes as if he's looking back on his past, looking back at the hardships of his early life, where difficult days were faced with courage, but the valleys swelled with the sound of Welsh voices. So it does make a very beautiful, idyllic picture of what the valley was like back in the day. Um, it was an immediate bestseller on publication in 1939, and it quickly became one of the best loved novels of the 20th century. It's poetic and nostalgic, an elegy to a lost world. So it's not necessarily about strikes as such, but there are some aspects of miners um, having a terrible and difficult time at that time. So he was actually, by the way, his pen name was Richard Llewellyn, but his real name was Richard Dafydd Vivian Llewellyn Lloyd. He lived from 1906 to 1963. And he actually began writing How Green Was My Valley when he was living in India, which is quite an interesting fact because I think you can really sense the nostalgia for Wales and the beautiful valleys of Wales that he was clearly feeling when he was living in India. But he did come back and carry on writing it when he got back home. And also, he wrote a sequel, Green, Green My Valley Now, and another novel called I Stand on a Quiet Shore. And one of his novels was made into an Oscar winning film, None But the Lonely Heart, which was published in 1943 and then starred Cary Grant in the film. So he was a pretty exciting and brilliant author writing about real miners' lives, but fictionalized. Another couple of books to mention, God's Bits of Wood, which is by Usmani Sambena, which describes, it's an African novel by one of the great African novelists. So Usmana Sembene, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, and translated by Francis Price, God's Bits of Wood, which describes a strike that was held on the Dakar Niger Railway in 1947 to 48, which is an intense and shocking tale. So this novel vividly captures the Dakar Niger Railway strike. It never ceases to shock, to inspire, and to shed light on an event that truly shaped the importance of the African culture. It's a book which does, to the modern Western reader, perhaps have some difficulties because there's a lot of different characters in it, and it's hard to get your head around the many different names. But it's a really exciting, dramatic event which describes a strike that was a revolt against the mistreatment and racism that the Africans had been experiencing for years by the European colonists that took advantage of them. And there's also another kind of prejudice addressed in this book, which is the issue of gender, which is about relating to the women who are constantly battling with their roles in society and with the equality that never seemed to be possible until the strike. So the strike actually gives them an opportunity to rewrite their future, seemingly. So that's a really interesting African novel, God's Bits of Wood by Usmane Sambene. I'll post the names of these later. Oh, yeah, so then while I was investigating literature about strikes, I came across this really lovely article all about a strike which took place in Stepney Green. And I'm just going to read you a bit about that. as my final entry, so to speak, tonight about strikes, um, because I found it particularly resonated with me because I used to live in Stepney Green myself after I left university. I lived in Stepney Green for about 5 years, and it is a place rich with amazing history. And there's this really fascinating article that I discovered all about a book which was called Stepney Words, which a journalist found in a school jumble sale. And when he first picked it up, he had no idea what a remarkable thing it was. So, Stepney Words is a collection of poems written by school children between the ages of 11 and 14. And I will read you a couple of the poems, hopefully, if I can get to them quickly. Um, they had titles like The Chance, Death in a Churchyard, The World is Dim and Dull, Let It Flow, Joe. And the writing in these lovely poems is incredibly vivid and raw. And on the cover of this book of poems is a very beautifully atmospheric cover photograph which shows dockyard cranes and heavy industry depicted in a brown haze that was very much part of the Stepney Green of those times. So, in a nutshell, um, this became a story about a man called Chris Searle, who was a young English teacher in May 1971, who was responsible for publishing this lovely collection of poems called Stepney Words. So he published it in 1971, this collection of his own students' poets. He'd encouraged his pupils to write about their lives and their neighbourhood. And he had done this partly because they were the same streets where his own literary hero, the great poet Isaac Rosenberg, had once lived. And now, for some mad reason, Searle, having published this collection of poems, was sacked by his school. And in response to his dismissal, on the 27th of May 1971, 800 pupils, including those from neighbouring schools, went on strike with banners aloft chanting, "We shall overcome," in the pouring rain. They refused to return to school until Chris Searle was reinstated, which is rather a fantastic, brilliant reason for a strike, I have to say. 800 pupils going on strike in order to bring back the teacher that they loved, who had published a book of poems for them, full of their poems, and he'd been sacked completely madly. So he wasn't immediately reinstated, much to my sadness on hearing this story. Um, it actually took a few months, but the children's strike was front page news, and the next day the strikers took to the streets of London, marching from Stepney to Trafalgar Square, making sure their route took them right through Fleet Street, which got them even more coverage. So these pupils got an enormous amount of um, positive vibes and coverage from the media. And amazingly, it still didn't mean that the poor teacher, Mr. Searle, got put back into, he was called Chris Searle, got back into teaching until I think it was not till the September when he went back. Um, so behind the scenes, controversy raged surrounding his reinstatement. In 1973, with support from the National Union of Teachers, he did get his job back, and the student strikers were vindicated. But by then, the older ones had already left the school, tragically. And on his return, Searle was ostracised. Sorry, uh, sorry, lost you there for a minute. Searle was ostracised by his fellow teachers. I think they must have been jealous because the poems were so good. He then moved to Langdon Park in Poplar, where he helped to publish another book called The People Marching On, which was a groundbreaking anthology of key events in East End history written by the English students. Stepney Words remained in print throughout the 70s and into the 80s, selling tens of thousands of copies. In 1973, it was compiled into two volumes of poems, and it was hailed as the great upsurge in community and working class publishing, where the movement to write and publish was taken up in a small area of East London. Today, it's being continued in many other towns and cities throughout the country. So that was 1973, and it actually seems like we've still got a long way to go before there's a more working class writers being published in a regular way, and people like Kit Duvall are doing her best to help people get published who are coming from working class backgrounds. And I'm just trying to quickly find some of these poems to read you a couple before we stop, because they're incredibly moving to read and absolutely brilliant. Of course, I did have them ready, and now I've lost them. I'll try, I might have a couple for you. If I don't, I'll have to share them with you another time. Where have they gone? Oh, I don't know if I'm going to find them quickly. Damn. I'll post a couple on my Instagram so that you can see them. But they're just brilliant school kids poems about day to day life, being at school, Stepney Green, what was it like, how grim and dirty it was, did they love it, did they not? They're very touching and very moving. So there's a bit of strike literature for you. I bet there's probably lots of books that I haven't mentioned that I should have. I'd love to know if you have any great books about strikes that you can share with me. Obviously, the most famous that I've mentioned is Emile Zola's Germinal, but then there's also the Ken Kesey novel, Sometimes a Great Notion, which is a really good read. Lysistrata, Aristophanes, of which there are very many modern versions, which are particularly brilliant and very funny, going on a sex strike. Steinbeck, In Dubious Battle. Um, and was there another one? Elizabeth Gaskell. She wrote a book called North South, which was all about how her main character leaves the church in a crisis of conscience. Margaret Hale is her main character, uprooted from her comfortable home in Hampshire to move with her family to the north of England. She's instantly repulsed by the ugliness of her new surroundings in the industrial town of Milton. And Margaret becomes aware of the poverty and suffering of the local mill workers and develops a passionate sense of social justice. This is intensified by her tempestuous relationship with the mill owner and self made man, John Thornton, as their fierce opposition over his treatment of his employees masks. Oh, now I've lost the rest of my blurb. Masks the underlying currents of tension, is essentially what I'm trying to say. So that's Elizabeth Gaskell in her book North South, which is another really interesting and political book which celebrates the lives of working class people. So, on that note, I'm going to come to an end. I'd love to know if you do have any thoughts about novels or fiction concerning strikes. I didn't come across that many. I'm sure there must be more that I didn't think of. There's a couple of kids' books which are about school strikes, but I did really love that Stepney Green anthology of poems, and which is called Stepney Words, which actually spawned a strike because all of the pupils walked out when their teacher was removed from service because he'd published the poems. Utter madness. Anyway, thank you all for joining me this evening on this day of strikes. I wonder if you've been affected by them. For me, it felt like being in lockdown again because everyone was at home because all our kids were off school due to the strikes, and it's made me feel like curling up and hibernating. So, on that note, good night. I'll see you next week.